Warcraft 3, what is the easiest race for beginners? I'm gonna answer that in this video. But do you hate those YouTube videos that promise to answer a question in the title, but then take forever to get to the point? Well, let's avoid doing that. I'm gonna give you the answer right now. The easiest race for beginners is human. But in the remainder of this video, I'll explain why I think humans are a good race for beginners in Warcraft 3, what are some of the hard and easy parts of each of the 4 races, and each race also has easy and difficult mechanics. So the difficulty level can largely be very personal, based on your specific playstyle. A difficult race can be played in an easy way if you play it off meta. And beginning players don't need to copy the top 0.1% of players. You don't need to play like the top players, and then no matter how difficult that is, that's the best way to play it, so I'm gonna play like that. That's an option. Additionally, I think it's more important that you enjoy whatever race you're playing than that it is somehow easy, because every human has different talents and skills and some don't have any. And you can still have fun, and that's fine. So let's first go to the first indication that human might be a little easier for people, and I'll give you some reasons. Could the easiest race maybe be the one that has the most player representation? It may be possible, though there's no way to prove it. On that note, Blizzard does not currently offer us an API to aggregate telemetry for the data of multiplayer playing, and therefore the distribution of players among the 4 different races in Warcraft 3. Because of this, we don't know which race is most played on Blizzard's official server, Battle.net. There's also a third-party server called W3 Champions. This platform does have a telemetry for us to be able to see which races get played the most. And as it turns out, human gets played the most, but not by a large margin. It's a little bit more than Orc, which is in 2nd place, a little bit more than Night Elf, which is in 3rd, and then Undead is the 4th most played, aka the least played. We're not counting random here, by a little bit larger of a drop off. So from Night Elf to Undead is the largest. So while correlation does not equal causation, this is potentially a hint towards the theory that the easiest race is also the one that's being played the most, which is human. As people generally are quite competitive and like winning, so they're more likely going to be drawn towards an experience where their current skill set gets easier wins, and then, that one ends up being the one that more people end up playing. Of course, there could be other reasons. It might just be because human is the most fun, or because you identify with them because you are actually a human in real life, or because they have the best in-game music or general aesthetic. But I think it is at least potentially a hint towards them being the easiest. Maybe that's why a bit more people play. But beyond this rather unreliable correlation of this given statistic, I also have some personal experience I would like to share. I believe human is easiest because they have a strong early game. Humans are the fastest at fast expanding, and they're the fastest at fast creeping. So it makes sense that they're going to be doing that relatively often. And this is a very proactive way to play the game, where you can have that plan going into a match to just take a bunch of creep camps or take an expansion really early. And it doesn't really rely on you scouting what the opponent is doing and then countering that, because humans at their core are a proactive rather than reactive race. And that's because their early game is very strong. So they're more likely trying to build their own early game rather than to play a more reactive role where it is of paramount importance to interrupt what an opponent is doing. A race with strong early game that can build themselves up. You have another race that is not very strong early, cannot build themselves up well. So they're going to, of course, try to disrupt the stronger race in order to slow them down. So a fast expansion and a fast creeping opener for human gives them immense pressure to deal damage and scale amazingly into the late game, into many different directions and unit choice possibilities. Just to name an example, when an Orc player starts a game against a human, they're generally thinking, how am I going to disrupt this human's creeping or fast expand? And they're going to have a lot of different results. But the human is just thinking, creeping, expanding. It's a little easier because it doesn't rely on the opponent's interactions. Now that's just the opener and maybe a little bit the macro and the scaling and the build-up. But for human micromanagement in battle, there's a bunch of units that automatically do good things. I truly believe Blizzard designed human, which is generally the most vanilla race, to really be the accessible one when you start on Warcraft 3. A lot of units automatically do the right thing without needing a lot of input. Priests that are walking around and on auto attack, they automatically cast heals This is an autocast ability, which you can turn off, but it's on by default. So Priest autocast heals, Sorceresses autocast slow, Spellbreakers autocast spell steal, and Priest also autocast inner fire. Knights, Rifles, and Griffins are relatively tanky and versatile units that can deal with many different situations, and they can fit into many different army compositions. And the race is generally well endowed with high armor via 5 armor buffs via inner fire, multiple points of armor buff via devotion aura, and knights having high natural armor as well. There's also the siege engine, which is the very definition and personification of armor with their high fortified armor, and all of this gives you more time to use your army than you would with another race that is more reliant on some kind of fragile glass cannon type of units. And if you ever forget to build a building on time, you can actually power build it with multiple peasants to catch up on lost time, something that everyone can do in Age of Empires games, but in Warcraft 3 only humans can do it. So there's a little margin of error correction there. So now that we've kind of answered the title of the video of why I think maybe human is the easiest, let's also jump into some of the easy and hard parts for all the 4 different races. And keep in mind that even though human is the easiest, it is not by such a large margin, because at the end of the day you're still playing an RTS that was made during the golden era of RTS, the best RTS ever made, though I'm a little biased. And so, of course, there is like an infinite ceiling of skill. And so, in essence, this question can only be answered at the super high level. Like, which one is the easiest to get super high with? Or which one has the highest ceiling? If you were like a perfect player, there's all kinds of different questions you can ask. But this is just very generally, when you start out with the game, which one do I think is like a little bit more accessible? Though it's fine to start literally with anyone. I've coached dozens of people over the last 2 decades. And it really doesn't matter what race you play, but these were my motivations for it. Now let's talk about some easy and hard things for every race, because every race has something that's harder or easier for them in particular. So I've grouped this into 5 major categories: supply management, army management, creeping management, base defense, and healing management. I think these are the 5 major skills, the 5 major managerial qualities one must have while playing Warcraft 3. So we'll start with supply management. Supply management is actually the hardest for human and the easiest for undead. For Night Elf and undead, it's pretty simple. Ziggurats can be started by a single acolyte. You can make multiple ziggurats at the same time with a single acolyte, and then you can go back to work, and that's it, right? You make and you forget. Moonwells also offer healing, so there's a lot of extra reason to make them early. And overmake them, because you get healing from it. So you're less likely to run into supply problems when you see it that way. It's very rewarding to make them early. It's a little harder for Orc and Human. Orcs' burrows can be very vulnerable in the early game. Basically the first 5 to 8 minutes before fortified burrows can come out, they're the only supply building that doesn't have fortified armor, but instead heavy. And therefore they're a major vulnerability for Orc. And that part can make supply management for Orc a little bit harder. For Human, it's a little harder because their farms only give 6 supply instead of 10. So it's simply something that you have to do slightly more often as a human player. So essentially for Human, it's the hardest. We go to army management, from hardest to easiest. I think army management, aka what we call micromanagement or control. So undead I think is the hardest. I think Orc and Human are somewhat similar. And Night Elf I think is the easiest. So Night Elf generally I think has pretty easy army micro. They tend to go for bears and dryads in many of the different matchups. Sometimes mountain giants. You can staff fairly frequently one of your units out to save them. Bears go around the map and they have rejuvenation with them, so that's something you can do. If you research Mark of the Claw, then you can roar while in bear form, so you don't have to worry as much about mid-fight transformations. And then Dryads have auto-abolish that remove buffs and debuffs from the right targets. And it's high damage, and Demon Hunter and Bears are tanky, and so since that's the go-to army, I think that generally that's pretty simple. It can be more difficult, but especially the older compositions, older metas were more difficult. Like back when it was like Huntress, Archer, Druid, Talon, there was a lot of micro min-maxing you could do. Now I think Night of Skill is more in the multitasking department. But army management, I think pretty easy for Elf. Orc battles can be quite hard, There are many moving pieces, many manually controllable melee units. Generally, there's a relatively high army diversity. Orc will have like Grunt, Headhunter, Raider, Kodo, sometimes Shaman, sometimes Walker, sometimes some Batrider or a Wyvern or two, one Catapult. So you could easily have anywhere from 4 to 8 different units in the fight, and control grouping them and using them effectively. And every unit, almost every unit has a special activatable ability, sometimes more. It can get pretty tricky in fights. On the upside, units are fairly beefy for Orc. Some of the units, especially the early unit like Grunt, fairly beefy. You've got Heal Wave and Spirit Link, which are great to enable some more reaction time to save your units. It makes it a lot easier. And some of the recent trends of the meta have made things easier as well. New trend includes going for Mirror Image on Blade Master instead of Windwalk, which means that you just click that button often and you get a lot of extra tankiness and some damage via those images. And all you need to do is click the button, and it has almost no cooldown, and it's a lot easier to use than Windwalk. Because when you Windwalk, your blade doesn't auto-attack anymore, so it's possible to forget about using your blade if you Windwalk in the mid of the battle. This is even happening sometimes to 1995 MMR players, such as Hearthstone, for instance. Berserker spam and Mirror Image makes it a little bit easier than like the more finicky Grunt Raider micro in some of the battles. Then Undead battles, I think, are probably the hardest. Fiend, Destroyer control, timely Death Coils, a timely Silence, Frost Nova targeting, obviously, some Frost armors. You got to put your statues in the right place to heal up your army, health and mana. You don't want them too far forward, but you don't want them all the way at the back. They're fairly vulnerable. Ghouls have the lowest tier 1 health. Well, actually, that's not true. It's archers. Ghouls are the lowest tier 1 health melee unit, and because they're melee, they need to get up close to the opponent. They're very vulnerable to splash damage, area of effect damage, so it's quite difficult if you're not happy, which is the #1 player in Warcraft 3 right now, to use ghouls very effectively. But then if you go for fiends, you need to do a lot of target firing and stutter step and pullback micro and focus fire, etc. So it can be pretty challenging to play undead in battles, and I think there's the highest ceiling and the highest floor for them as well. When it comes to human, you can have some absolutely diabolically difficult human army compositions, such as rifles, sorceress, priest, flying machine, mortar, footmen, and spellbreakers as well. When you combine all that together and there's like 10 bears moving on top of your army and you need to like kite back but also stand your ground, it can be pretty tough. Mortars on the dryads, rifles only on the dryads if they're near, flying machine takes out the fairy dragon, breakers form the front and the front. There's quite a lot to do. But then there's also easier human compositions such as knights and flying machines. That's it, against undead, which is meta now. The rifle stuff that I talked about is a bit of an older meta, or specifically against elf. And then you've got siege engines and griffins, which is another new meta against undead for human players. Those are easier to do in battle than some of the other styles we've seen, like rifle priest against undead was really tough. And they're relatively easy to copy, these types of styles. All right, let's talk about creeping management. Creeping management basically means when you go around the map and you take one creep camp and then the next and the next, how difficult or easy is it to kill the creeps efficiently without taking too much damage and then healing yourself up in between again and then continuing onwards. So I think it's the hardest for Orc and the easiest for human, with Undead being the second hardest. So for the early game, minute 2 to 3, I think Elf actually has the hardest, the most difficult period. There's quite a bit of multitasking exactly at 2 minutes into the game, and then for the next minute or so for Night Elf, you're initially managing your Ancient of War creeping, which a lot of beginners are afraid of, and I think it actually makes Night Elf starts a little bit more challenging. Ancient of War creeping is very important for Night Elf, not just the first camp, but also maybe the fourth camp, where the main Ancient of War walks over and engages in a more difficult camp. But purely speaking about the first camp, I've seen in Bronze and Silver, this gets messed up a lot. The Ancient of War will accidentally claim the last hit, which denies experience, or you lose the Ancient of War, or you accidentally built it in a place that has a hidden aggro radius that wakes up the camp and then kills your Ancient of War. There's a lot of hilarious ways where it can go wrong, and because of this, in beginner guides for Elf, I don't even include Ancient of War creeping in there at all. But without Ancient of War creeping, Night Elf is barely even the same race, because creeping will be very slowly compared to others, and they kind of need that boost to be balanced with the rest. The game by now has been balanced around that. So this is a slightly tedious thing that scares some people off. If you play more, then it kind of needs to be a part of it. And Ancient of War creeping is happening at the exact same time that you are managing the final dots on the eye in your main base, where you're getting your second Moonwell finished, and you need to tech to tier 2 at 21 population, and meanwhile you've got a Wisp scouting the enemy. There can be quite a lot going on, and it makes it a little bit harder, but after that it's mostly smooth sailing for Elf. Once Elf has like a demon level 2 or 3, you can tank creeps and then just go home and heal from the Moonwell with a single click. And once you get Druids of the Claw out, you can rejuvenate in between every creep camp, so you've pretty much got healing on the go. It's your primary fighting unit, and it also is very strong, tanky, high damage, and it heals itself up. So it gets a lot easier for Elf. So just the early game is hard, and after that it gets a lot easier. Then when it gets to Orc creeping starts very simple. There's really very little to do in the first 4 minutes of a game with Orc, but then starts the constant juggling of healing salves to heal up units in a race that pretty much doesn't have mass healing available at all until Master Tier Witch Doctors, which no one really goes for because of meta considerations. It is too difficult to get to them while giving up other things, the opportunity cost of it. Healing Wave makes things a lot easier. It is a bit more expensive to heal up units with level 1 or 2 Healing Wave compared to using healing salves, but it's so much easier. The only problem is the main hero compositions are Blade Shadow and Farseer TC. Farseer Shadow has some drawbacks in lack of damage, and so the Farseer is much easier hero than Blade. So for beginners I would recommend Farseer first, but then TC, the Tauren Chieftain, is usually the standard follow-up, and TC doesn't have any healing, so you would have to have Shadow. So it all comes down to heal salves. That makes creeping quite tedious for Orc players, for beginners. Personally, it's not a problem for me, but for beginners, obviously. Human early game creeping allows for a lot of min-maxing, but overall, even for lower level players, pulling Militia to just help out with the first or the second camp and help creep out a big camp is a big help. I have seen that lower level players will sometimes lose some Footmen and Militia when creeping camps in my Bronze League Heroes series, but even so, they will still creep a little faster with it. Then when it gets to the early to mid game, human players don't really like poison creeps all that much. Poison creeps try to poison everybody around them, and there's many human units because Footmen are more numerous than grunts. So that means that poison creeps in total deal more damage to human units than to Orc units, for instance. It leaves many of the Footmen hurt. But overall, Water Elementals and Militia give human a good jumpstart to begin creeping, and once priests are out at like minute 7, then everything gets a lot more comfortable, because everything will be healed up automatically. Until then, you sometimes need to rely on sending Footmen home in the very early tier 1 game, and sometimes getting a scroll of regeneration from your vault to heal up a lot of the poisoned Footmen. At the lower level, undead players doing creeping, they will sometimes lose ghouls to creeps, I have seen in the Bronze Leagues. They can instead opt to go for a Fiend Opener, which will be a lot more sturdy and easy, but it is very slow to get started on creeping in this way. When using ghouls, you actually need to do something called the Ghoul Shuffle, and this is a little harder for low level players. Basically what a Ghoul Shuffle is you take your starter hero, which could be any of the 4 altar heroes from Undead, usually Death Knight, but I've seen some others, right? It's fine. You take your ghouls, anywhere from 2 to 5 ghouls, you go creeping, and then once a ghoul is like 30% health or less, you take it out of your control group and you send it home. Then once it goes home, it starts gathering lumber, and it stands on Blight, the blighted ground, which is the black ground that you spawn in on, and this actually gives quadruple regeneration to a ghoul as what a Footman or grunt normally enjoys. It's a relatively fast rate of regeneration. You then take new and fresh ghouls that have spawned from the crypt onto the graveyard or mining towards the necropolis. You take the fresh ghouls and you add them to your group, but ideally they drop off their lumber first before coming into the fray and starting to join creeping. And then you go to the next camp and you do it again. This is the ideal way to play it, and if you don't do it, you'll spend more mana on coils, you're going to lose more ghouls to creeps, and so that part is a bit more difficult, which is why I rated Undead second hardest. Then we get to base defense, the next category of management. Who has the hardest base to defend and who has the easiest base to defend? Well, I think human base is the hardest to defend. Peasants are very vulnerable. They have 220 health. And while they can turn into militia to call upon for defense, this is by far the messiest method of base defense that any of the 4 races have for beginners. It's easy to call the wrong amount of militia, and while militia do gain armor when they pick up their ramshackle shield and mace, they still are, underneath all that, 220 health peasants. Peasants that do not get called into militia for slow reacting human players have medium armor and are therefore super vulnerable. They don't regenerate as fast as acolytes around a mine, and they can't fight back like ghouls. They can't hide in burrows like orcish peons, and they can't hide in gold mines like night elven wisps, so they're vulnerable. It can help to make an early arcane tower, but the arcane tower is very scary to mana holding creatures. But non-mana holding creatures like ghouls, footmen and grunts can wreak havoc on your peasant line. So this makes human a target for constant attacks, not just in the early game, but the mid to late game as well. As a human, you will get used to getting prosecuted by all the other 3 races in a constant barrage of harassment. But that's also partially because you are strong when left alone. So now you kind of know more about the human identity. For low-level Night Elf players, Elven Wisps can feel pretty vulnerable. Archers are not very good dueling units, so they need to do a lot of running away. But overall though, Elf does have buildings that can fight back, like the Ancient of War, the Tree of Life, etc. And Moonwells that bequeath healing with just a single click. The goldmine workers are hidden, and the goldmine is also free to repair, so there's very little that can go wrong. Overall, Night Elf is pretty easy. Undead bases also have very good base defense and are therefore easier to defend. They have a very scary reputation, and for good reason. A Nerubian tower that upgrades from the Ziggurat offers a slow attack, as does the Halls of the Dead or Black Citadel, which are the upgraded forms of your starting building, the Necropolis. They have the most powerful defensive effect because of that slow. Additionally, Acolytes are exposed, but they regenerate fast on Blight. And as I said, Blighted Ground gives quadruple regen that orcs and humans normally enjoy. For orc bases, it can defend itself pretty well against light harassment. Putting peons in burrows offers them a spear attack that throws spears at attackers. This works against both ground and air units, which is nice. But it only fends off light attacks, as it should be, right? Orcs have to defend their base if they want to defend it. In particular, before fortified burrows are researched, burrows are so vulnerable that they are in fact the target, not necessarily the peons that can hide inside, it's the burrows. And this can destabilize the entire orcish game plan. So orcish bases can be pretty difficult to defend, especially until minute 6, 7 or 8 or 9, or whenever the orc chooses to get fortified defenses. After they click that button, orc base becomes one of the easiest to defend. Then we get to the final management category that I chose to include here, though I'm sure you can think of more. Healing management in general, not just when creeping, but in general. So for undeads have many forms of healing, and so for them it's actually the easiest, I think, healing management. You've got Blighted Ground, which offers passive regen, Unholy Aura, passive regen, Death Coil, which is very low cooldown healing from the Death Knight onto a single target, Vampiric Aura from the Dreadlord, passive regen, Obsidian Statues, which gives passive healing, in pulses to up to 6 units around them. It all comes together to give this kind of massive passive or easy healing. There's also additional methods of healing. There's actually a lot. Fiend Burrow gives fiends regeneration. Ghouls can cannibalize, as can abominations. It's finding a corpse and then eating it. Hope we don't get demonetized for this. And then that gives them a lot of extra healing. And there's also the new shop item, the Ritual Dagger, which can sacrifice a summoned unit or even a real one to give regen, just like the human regeneration scroll. This is a new item. It was added very recently in 2020. Overall, there are many options, and more options for undead than for any other race to have sources of healing. And so I think they're in a really good spot for managing the health of their units. Orcs get healing from just 3 sources, not counting Troll Regeneration passive upgrade, which affects Witch Doctors, Troll Headhunters, and Troll Bat Riders. But when we're talking about healing that can apply to, for instance, heroes or grunts, and we're not counting the neutral items that anyone can use, like Healing Potion and Healing Scroll, Orc just has 3 forms of healing, the fewest, I believe, of any race. Or at least it feels that way, because 1 is so rare. Healing Salve from the shop, the Voodoo Lounge, Healing Wave from the Shadow Hunter, which only works if you have Shadow, and Healing Ward from Troll Witch Doctor, which is one of the least used units in 1-on-1. So if you don't have Shadow, it's just Healing Salves. Just imagine, any damage you take, any point in the game, if you want to heal it up, heal salves, and you pay money for that. It's not free like Priest, Moonwells, or Statues, etc. Overall, the hardest. Then you've got Night Elf. Night Elf has Moonwells, Druids of the Claw, Rejuvenation, and maybe Keeper of the Grove, Tranquility if you get level 6, which is not reliable. There's also not a lot of sources of healing. Elven basic units do regenerate twice as fast at night, but don't regenerate at all during the day. Elves can actually get serious healing problems, especially when not playing Druid of the Claw based builds, which is why most people play Druid of the Claw based builds, because it offers rejuvenation. This is also why some people hire the Goblin Alchemist from the tavern as a Night Elf player. When you go Mass Huntresses and Archers, pretty much you cannot get enough healing from your Moonwells. Instead, you just drink the Moonwells with your Alchemist and then you healing spray the entire block of Hunters and Archers. Despite the initial easy factor of healing from Moonwells, I would say Elf is probably second worst at healing after Orc, which makes humans the second best. Human healing management comes in the form of Regeneration Scroll, Priest Healing, Staff of Sanctuary, and Holy Light from the Paladin. Not a terribly big amount of sources of healing either, and this is why, you know, humans, they will pop a Regeneration Scroll when they Town Portal out of a fight. It heals everyone around them, and you can kind of get started on healing some of that hurt. But for the really big hurt, you need Holy Light, Staff of Sanctuary, or some Priest attention. If you're running Priest in your build, you're pretty much always automatically fine. It's really easy, you know, it happens fast after any skirmish. But if you don't, you're going to rely on Staff of Sanctuary and Paladin. And that's why non-Priest builds for human pretty much include Tier 3 and Staff and Paladin. Of course, it's also possible to play a generally difficult race and to cut out some of the difficult parts and make it easier for yourself. If you don't play the meta, and if you play off meta, it can be easier. I have one example for every of the 4 races if you like to make it a little bit easier for yourself. So the meta for humans is to fast expand at tier 1 most of the time at the high level, but you can make it a little easier. Initially it has a hard build order, but if you go for this build with Paladin rifles, then you have a hard build order, but everything else becomes easy. You just have this strong fighting army, it's very tanky, it has good damage, you can fight early, you can fight constantly, and you pretty much just have a plan. When you get Paladin level 3 and you get your Blood Mage and your long rifles upgrade out, you go fight. And then you either win or you lose. And that's so simple conceptually. So while I say, hey, you know, the top meta human can be pretty difficult to manage, this part is easier for beginners maybe, the Paladin build order. Then for Orc, the meta could be something like Blade or Farseer into Headhunter creeping. And then you go to tier 2 and you make a whole bunch of different units, like 5+ different units. You can play it easier. You can just do 1 base, Farseer, tech with 12 peons, 5 in gold, 7 on lumber, 1 burrow. You only have a Farseer, no barracks. You tech to tier 2, you get to tier 2, you make 2 bestiaries. You either go solo hero or you get a second hero like Shadow, Naga, Dark Ranger. And then you just go a whole bunch of wyverns. Super easy to do conceptually. You're on a clock because it's going to be obsolete eventually. People can counter it, but you can attack early and hard, and it's going to get you a whole bunch of wins, right? So you take a race that's conceptually a little bit more difficult, Orc, where you have to learn enemy predilections, you have to learn their creep route, and then how to disrupt it, and when can I creep steal, and can I creep jack them here or there, and what unit should I make, how do I micro them? No. Just Farseer, fast tech wyverns gets a lot easier, right? And Orc can do that. They're the best at fast teching among the 4 races. Then for Undead, if you look at the top meta, it's like Death Knight first, and then Lich and Dark Ranger. And then you go for Ghouls, transitioning into Fiends and Destroyers, and you hit this 9 minute 20 seconds timing attack with your first Orb of Corruption, 3rd hero, and Destroyer upgrade. But you could also just make it simpler. Go for a Crypt Lord, make a whole bunch of Ghouls. I don't care when you tech, right? You just Crypt Lord, make a whole bunch of Ghouls, walk to your expansion, creep it, build a gold mine, drop a skull, drop a ziggurat, make a Nerubian. Then you go for Graveyard, Morzigus, you tower up both of your bases, and then you go like 3 Crypts, Moss Ghouls, Mass Gargoyle. Super easy to do. I know you're going to be able to get wins with that as well, and you don't have to deal with all the finicky micro of triple hero, silence, coil nova, statue management, etc., destroyer, absorb. Yeah, it can be a lot easier. And then so for Night Elf, their meta is Demon Hunter and Naga, and then a few archers into bears and dryads. So this is the top meta, but if you want to make it easier, actually you can't make it easier than that, can you? That's already the easiest. No, but in all seriousness, you can make it a little bit easier. You could do like tier 1 Keeper, double Ancient of War, Mass Huntresses, and then the game gets real easy as well. So anyway, that's kind of the conclusion here. The easy answer is Human might be the best race for the beginners, followed by Orc, and then Night Elf, and finally Undead being the hardest. And the extensive answer is there's difficult and easy parts for every race. Just choose your favorite, and there's going to be an easier way to play as well. Find your own way to play and just have fun with the game, right? I also have a Discord channel, discord.gg/grubby, where we have a Warcraft 3 build order channel where I pinned a couple of build orders that you can follow so that you can find something you like to play with. There's a lot of non-meta stuff in there, so you can have some fun with it. And I've also got some Bloody Beginner guides on my Warcraft 3 YouTube channel, youtube.com/@followgrubby. There's a bunch of beginner guides there where I kind of try to show you the ropes. Alright, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. What race is most difficult for you to play? And which race has been easiest for you to play? Let me know in the comments. Always love reading those. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Peace.